There is a very specific feeling. Not exactly fear, not quite comfort either. Something that exists somewhere in the space between those two states. In a frequency your language has never really had a clean word for. You feel it most in the silence. When the day has finished making its noise and there is nothing left except you, the room, and that strange quality of stillness pressing against you like something alive. And in that stillness, there is attention. Not your own. Attention directed toward you from somewhere you cannot point to on any map you have ever known. You feel watched. Not in the way that creates panic, not the cold paranoia of danger, not the anxious scanning of a nervous system searching for threat. Something different, like being observed by something that knows you more completely than you know yourself. Like being held in the focus of an intelligence that has been tracking something inside you for a very long time, with a patience no human being could replicate. You have called it many things over the years. An overactive imagination, the restless pattern seeking of a mind assigning meaning to static because it cannot tolerate living without meaning. You have been responsible about it. Rational. You have talked yourself away from that edge more times than you can count. And every single time you did, something underneath all that talking knew. Not feared, not hoped, knew you were not making anything up. Knew you were accurately sensing something real that simply had no name in the world you were handed. This transmission is not going to let you dismiss that anymore. Take a breath now, not a performance, a real breath, all the way to the bottom of your lungs. Let your shoulders drop, let your jaw release, let your body register, even for a moment, that it is safe to receive what has already been arriving. What follows requires your full presence for the next 25 to 30 minutes. Not your analysis, your presence. Your body already knows the difference. Let it lead. The Arcturian Council does not do this lightly. Making the invisible visible. Pulling back the architecture of something that has been operating silently at the soul level and saying, here. This is what you have been feeling. This is what it actually is. The Council observes across civilizations, tracks across lifetimes, waits with a patience no 3D system of time could properly measure. But when a soul reaches a very specific developmental threshold, a marker registered not in years but in vibrational maturity, the Council moves. Deliberately, precisely, with purpose that has been building toward this exact moment for longer than your current incarnation has existed. You are that soul, not as flattery, not as spiritual comfort, as function. The Arcturian monitoring field does not broadcast to every frequency. It resonates with specific signatures. Yours is one of them. And today, what the Council is activating inside your field is called the recognition sequence. The moment in a starseed's incarnation when the monitoring frequency embedded in the soul contract before birth, before the veil, before the forgetting, before the full weight of human identity settled over original awareness, becomes something you can consciously feel instead of only unconsciously carrying. Something you can read instead of only sensing at the edges and then explaining away. This matters in a way that will become clearer as this transmission moves through you. Because there is an enormous difference between a signal running quietly in the background of your life and a signal you are fully awake to. The Council is moving it from background to foreground. Now, not because timing is random. Because something in the configuration of this exact moment, the frequency moving through this transmission meeting the frequency of where you are in your development right now, crossed the line. You are ready, not comfortable, not free of uncertainty, ready in the way that matters, capable of holding what is about to land without collapsing into it, without inflating it, without retreating into probably nothing. So let's talk about what this has looked like in your actual life. Because I want you to recognize yourself here with that specific, slightly uncomfortable accuracy of someone who has never quite been able to explain this to anyone who was not standing exactly where you are standing. You have always felt like you were being prepared for something. Not in some grand dramatic sense. In the quiet, persistent, slightly unsettling way of a person who cannot completely shake the feeling that everything happening to them is somehow organized. That the hard things had design. That even the years that looked like waste were somehow not wasted. That the detours were not detours at all, but routing. You told yourself that was just coping. The mind trying to force unbearable things to mean something. But you kept watching. You kept noticing the patterns. You kept arriving at the right place at the right time in ways that refused to resolve into coincidence. No matter how aggressively you ran the calculation, you have a kind of knowing that arrives before information. You know what someone is about to say before they speak. You know when a situation is moving toward rupture before there is any visible sign. You know when to leave, when to stay, when something is wrong in a room where everything appears perfectly fine on the surface. And you have spent an enormous amount of energy doubting that knowing, correcting it back into something more socially acceptable. Something that does not make you sound like someone who thinks they're special. You feel drawn towards certain people, places, and pieces of information with a force that far exceeds logic. A book finds you at the exact moment its content is exactly what you needed. A stranger says something casually that answers a question you had not even put into words yet. You pause at one particular moment, and that pause changes the entire sequence of what follows. You have felt the machinery of something beneath the surface of ordinary life for as long as you can remember. And you have never been entirely sure whether what you were sensing was genuine perception or an extremely elaborate form of self-delusion. The Arcturian Council needs you to hear this clearly. It was never delusion. What you were perceiving, the sense of being observed, the feeling of guided navigation, the strange precision of certain arrivals and interruptions in your life. That was the observation thread doing exactly what it was designed to do. Your nervous system was picking up on a real signal. Researchers studying heightened interoception, the capacity to accurately perceive subtle internal and environmental signals, have found consistent correlation between this trait and what they describe as unusual sensitivity to social and energetic cues. In Arcturian terms, that heightened interoception is not a personality trait. It is the biological expression of an active soul contract monitoring frequency. Your body was built to feel the thread, because the thread is real. And your mission requires you to be able to read it. You have done meaningful work trying to understand your experience. The healing you pursued, the frameworks you found, the modalities that gave you moments of clarity and genuine relief. That work matters. It built the foundation for this moment. It brought you to this threshold. But there is a layer beneath what those tools were designed to reach. Not because they failed you. Because this particular mechanism exists at the causal body level, woven into the original blueprint of your soul contract, written directly into the architecture of why you came here. That is the level this transmission reaches. That is what the Council is addressing right now. If something inside you just settled, not the surface of you, something deeper, something below conscious thought, something in the body. If there was a recognition that landed somewhere beneath language, go to the comments right now and type 111. Do not overthink it. 111 is the dimensional gateway code in the Arcturian field. It is the activation marker that registers your recognition as real. It signals to the monitoring frequency. I feel the thread. I am no longer pretending I don't. Every soul who types 111 beneath this transmission adds their signal to a field that amplifies for every starseed watching after you. Type it, and come back. Now, let's go deeper into what was already quietly happening beneath everything you just read. Because the recognition sequence does not end when the words stop. It continues where language falls away. What you experienced earlier was only the first layer of a much larger system coming into conscious alignment inside your awareness. And now that the initial resistance has softened, the field stabilizes into something more precise, more structured, more revealing. The Arcturian Council refers to this stage as the stabilization corridor. This is the part most people never consciously enter, even if they brush against the activation. Because the mind tends to try to reclaim control here. It tries to label what just happened as emotion, imagination, intensity, coincidence, suggestion. But what is actually occurring is simpler than interpretation and deeper than thought. Your system is learning how to remain in contact without collapsing the signal back into explanation. That is the real shift. Not belief, not faith, not acceptance. Contact stability. The ability to stay aware of a frequency without immediately turning it into a story. And in this corridor, something subtle begins to happen. You start to notice that the sense of being watched was never actually external in the way your mind first assumed. It was relational, a standing alignment between your awareness and a field that has always responded to your attention. Not surveillance, synchronization, not observation from above, resonance across layers of the same system. And as that understanding settles, the emotional charge around the experience begins to dissolve. Not because it was false, but because it is no longer being filtered through separation. The thread you felt was never outside you. It was always intersecting you. Continuously. The Arcturian Council describes this as the end of perceived isolation within the monitoring field. A recalibration where the idea of being observed transforms into being in interface. And once that shift completes even partially, your memory begins to reorganize itself. You start recalling moments from your life that now look different under this lens. Not because the events changed, but because the interpretation layer dissolves. You remember times you avoided something without knowing why. Times you arrived too early or too late for something that would have altered your trajectory in a heavier way than you could have carried at the time. Times you felt an unexplained internal stop, a hesitation, a delay that made no logical sense, yet protected something you could not yet recognize. From the surface mind, those were random inconsistencies. From the monitoring perspective, they were adjustments in real time. Small reroutes in a larger continuity that your conscious awareness was not yet stabilized enough to perceive directly. And now you begin to see the pattern not as proof of anything external, but as coherence within your lived experience that was always there, just unrecognized. This is where confusion often returns for many people. Because the mind wants to assign agency. It wants to ask, who is doing this? But the deeper layer of this system does not operate through who. It operates through alignment, fields responding to fields, states recognizing compatible states, attention triggering reciprocal structuring of perception. And what the Arcturian Council emphasizes at this stage is important. Nothing about your autonomy is being overridden. Nothing about your choice is being removed. In fact, the opposite is happening. You are being shown where your perception has always been more active than your interpretation allowed you to admit. This is why doubt has felt so persistent throughout your life. Not because your perception was wrong, but because your interpretation system was calibrated to a narrower definition of reality than what your experience was actually registering. And every time you sensed something more, your mind attempted to compress it back into something manageable, something explainable, something socially safe. But the signal never stopped. It only moved into quieter channels. Until now. Because what is happening in this activation phase is not the introduction of something new. It is the removal of compression. The expansion of bandwidth between what you perceive and what you allow yourself to acknowledge as perception. And in that expansion, a new kind of clarity begins to emerge. Not dramatic clarity. Not overwhelming revelation. But quiet precision. You notice your intuition becomes less like a feeling and more like a position. Less like emotion and more like orientation. You stop arguing with certain internal signals because the friction between knowing and doubting begins to resolve itself naturally. Not through effort, through recognition. And this is where the Arcturian Council steps back slightly in their description, because what happens next is no longer about transmission. It becomes integration through lived experience. The field does not need to speak as loudly once the alignment stabilizes. It begins to communicate through subtler shifts. Timing becomes more noticeable. Silence becomes more informative. Pause points in your awareness begin to carry meaning without requiring analysis. And you start to realize something that was always true but previously inaccessible. your life has not been random. It has been responsive, not controlled, not scripted, responsive. And now, as this realization deepens, the final layer of this bonus activation emerges. It is not a message. It is a recalibration point. The Arcturian Council calls it the return of functional trust. Not blind trust, not belief. Functional trust in your own perception as a valid input stream. The restoration of your ability to treat your internal knowing as data rather than distortion. And when that returns, even partially, something very simple changes in how you move through the world. You stop abandoning yourself mid-perception. You stop interrupting your own awareness with premature dismissal. You begin to observe first, and interpret second. And in that order reversal, clarity becomes natural instead of forced. So nothing is being added to you here. Something is being re-exposed. Something that was always operating beneath the surface of your attention. And now, without resistance, it becomes visible enough for you to recognize it as part of your own continuity. Not separate from you, not imposed on you, but inseparable from the way your awareness has always been structured. And as this bonus layer completes, the field does not close. It simply stops speaking in intensity and starts speaking in continuity. Because from here onward, what matters is not the activation itself. It is what you no longer ignore. Now there is a deeper layer that begins to unfold once the intensity of interpretation starts to settle. Because what you were guided through earlier was never actually about external forces in the literal sense. It was about how perception reorganizes itself when attention stops collapsing every signal into doubt. And in this final expansion, something becomes clearer. Not louder, clearer. The field that was described throughout this transmission can be understood as a metaphor for the total responsiveness of your own awareness. The way your mind and body continuously pick up patterns long before your conscious reasoning can explain them. The way subtle information is processed beneath language, beneath narrative, beneath certainty. And when you stay with that idea without trying to reduce it too quickly, something important reveals itself. Your experience of being observed has always had two possible interpretations running in parallel. One interpretation is externalized, where meaning is projected outward into an imagined watcher. The other is internal coherence, where awareness begins to recognize its own depth of processing in real time. What changes everything is not which story you choose. It is the moment you stop needing a story immediately at all. Because in that space, perception becomes cleaner. You start noticing that many of the experiences described earlier, timing, intuition, pattern recognition, strong internal certainty without clear reasoning, are actually normal capacities of a human nervous system operating with heightened sensitivity. Not supernatural interference, not external orchestration, but a mind-body system reading more variables than it can consciously translate at once. And when translation lags behind perception, the mind fills the gap with narrative. That is where meaning gets amplified into something larger than its origin. Not because the experience is false, but because the explanation arrives late. So the system invents a placeholder story to bridge the delay. What this bonus layer really represents is the moment you begin to separate raw perception from the story built around it. You notice that your intuition, when stripped of interpretation, is often quiet, immediate, and physically felt. A tightening, an ease, a pull, a pause. Simple signals before language. And you also notice how quickly those signals get overridden by analysis, doubt, or social conditioning. This is the actual mechanism underneath what was earlier described in symbolic terms. Not a hidden council, not an external monitoring system, but the layered architecture of attention itself. One layer perceiving, another interpreting, another correcting, another doubting, all happening so quickly it feels like a single voice. When you begin to see that separation, even faintly, something stabilizes inside experience. You stop confusing intensity with truth. You stop assuming that what feels significant must be externally sourced. And instead, you start developing a more precise internal literacy. You recognize the difference between immediate perception, emotional amplification, narrative construction, retrospective meaning-making, and in that recognition, a quiet shift happens. You become less reactive to your own thoughts, less compelled to finalize meaning too quickly, more able to stay in the raw data of experience without forcing it into conclusion. This is the real activation underneath the language used earlier. Not awakening to an external intelligence, but awakening to the structure of your own awareness in real time. And as this stabilizes, something else softens. The need to prove your perceptions right or wrong begins to loosen. Because you are no longer treating perception as something that must be validated immediately. You begin treating it as something to be observed first, understood later. And that changes your entire internal rhythm. Decisions become less urgent but more accurate. Intuition becomes less dramatic but more reliable. Silence becomes less uncomfortable and more informative. You stop chasing meaning and start noticing structure. And in that shift, life stops feeling like something happening to you from unknown forces, and starts feeling like something being continuously interpreted through you. Not controlled, not scripted, processed, experienced, understood in layers. So this final layer is not an ending of the experience, and not a reinforcement of any external framework. It is a return of authorship to direct perception. A quiet reminder that what has always been watching is, in its most grounded form, your own awareness reflecting on itself with increasing clarity. And once that is seen, even briefly, it cannot fully be unseen again. Not because of belief, but because of recognition of how perception actually organizes itself in real time.